Hello? Hey there? Hey there? That's pretty weird. It says that the orientation is locked on my phone. That's interesting. Um, so does that mean that I have to turn it around? What does that mean? I'm going to take the phone out here and figure this out. So, yeah, I guess we'll just do it this way. We'll have a horizontal live. I don't particularly care for that, but there you go. Well, there you go. Very strange. I don't know why my orientation is locked. This is very odd. So there you go. I've got an iPhone, and I don't know what's going on there. My iPhone is being very, very strange. So there you go. I'm trying to fix the settings, and it ain't working out too well. Well, there you go. I guess we'll just do it this way this evening. How's this, folks? You can see Frida Kahlo behind me. There you go. What else is new, folks? Sorry for the strangeness of all of this. Glad to be here, as always. So Venezuela is on our minds, isn't it, folks? At the border with Venezuela's border with Brazil, Venezuela's border with Colombia, a lot is happening, right? The U.S. government is demanding that aid be sent into the country. They are then accusing the Venezuelan government of being in violation of international law. We know that Elliot Abrams, who is a member of the Trump administration, has a history of sneaking weapons into countries under the guise of humanitarian aid. And we know that at this point there is some kind of concert happening in which they're trying to present the image as if the crisis in Venezuela is humanitarianism, as if evil Maduro is just ruining everything. And yeah, it's pretty crazy. So that's certainly happening. And, you know, we're all looking at that situation on the borders of Venezuela very, very closely right now, because it seems like on some level there's an attempt to try and provoke some kind of situation in which a U.S. military intervention could be justified. And it seems like there is just an all-out effort. It reminds you of the various reports about the Syrian government using chemical weapons. We now know a BBC producer has come forward and said that the incident in Duma, and the incident that took place roughly 1 year ago, they've investigated it. It was staged. But it looks like they're trying to create some kind of situation in which they could carry out one of their humanitarian interventions. Very frightening, very disturbing, something we should all be watching very closely. The people of Venezuela have got to be nervous. At this point, the USA's got Juan Guaido as their guy, and they're trying to very much create a situation in which they could overthrow the government of Venezuela. So keep our eyes on it. Now, we know that Russia and China are standing strong. They recognize Maduro. Russia has come forward and said that any attempt to overthrow the Venezuelan government would be, a violation. The Security Council is prepared to take action. We know that China has stepped up their aid to Venezuela. We know that they were circulating rumors at one point that China had met with the Venezuelan opposition. Well, that was not true. China has come forward, said that was fake news. They have not done that. But we also know that, in Brazil and in Colombia, we have right-wing pro-U.S. governments that want to see Maduro removed. We've got kind of an escalation of U.S. rhetoric. So the situation on the borders of Venezuela with Colombia and Brazil is certainly intense. So we're all watching that situation. It's very, very intense. What else is on people's minds? Shout out to Kinky. Glad you're joining us. Shout out to Kyle Davis. Shout out to someone calling themselves Taste the Rambo. That's interesting. Shout out to Kyle. Shout out to various people. Wow, a lot of us are joining us. I'm glad you're here with me. Sorry that the video quality tonight is not what it should be. I don't know why my phone is not cooperating, but there you go. Shout out to Ramiro. Shout out to everyone who's joining us. A lot that's going on in the world as we speak right now. I actually, a friend of mine, Miriam, sent me some interesting news about some low-wage workers in Ohio who quit in solidarity with each other, right? The fast food workers were being mistreated on the job, and it was basically they all quit in solidarity. Very exciting, right? The low-wage workers, across the country. I mean, Trump says it's a booming economy, but how can it be a booming economy when so many young people are stuck in low-wage jobs, when household debt is through the roof, when overall income and spending power is dropping? How can this be a booming economy? I mean, the facts are not there. A lot of people are suffering in what's supposed to be a booming economy. Now, Kyle Davis is saying, and can you tell who cares for what? Cuba sends doctors and medicine to Venezuela while the West gets ready to invade. Sure, and aid is being sent to the country from Russia, from China. It's not they're not accepting aid. I think that they view the aid from the United States as being some kind of Trojan horse. They view this whole crisis as an attempt to create some kind of provocation. But as someone else mentioned, we're also got our eyes on the situation with Vietnam, where we understand that Trump and President Kim of North Korea, Democratic People's Republic of Korea, will be meeting. So Trump and Kim are set to meet. That's very, very exciting. It'll be meeting number 2 between the two world leaders. That's certainly a big deal, a big situation there. And we know that China has a lot to do with the new excited hopes for peace on the Korean Peninsula, the hope for peaceful reunification. Very, very exciting development. But what else is happening, folks? A lot is going on in the world. Now, I know there's this video floating around the internet of Dianne Feinstein, the mainstream Democrat, who's just kind of part of the Democratic Party machine of San Francisco, being confronted by all these school kids, children, youths who want the Green New Deal. And they approach her, and she, what does she say? She says, "Wow, kids, I'm sorry I don't agree with you, but I'm so glad you're involved in the political process. I'm glad you came to my office. You just inspire me. You're the next generation. You're the hope for the future. I'm so glad to see you." Is that what she said? No, not what she said. Wasn't too thrilled to talk to these young people. Now, at this point, a lot of people are outraged by how she talked to them. I am certainly no fan of Dianne Feinstein's, I'll tell you that much. And I think it's interesting. It needs to be said that Dianne Feinstein, she represents an interesting history within the Democratic Party, right? If people look at the history of the Democratic Party in California, she really emerged as the Democratic Party of California was kind of reforming itself, and you could say it was almost the beginning of what Clinton really finished up with the DLC, the Democratic Leadership Council, where there was almost, you could say, a purge in the Democratic Party of more left-wing elements. And the circumstances in which Dianne Feinstein became the mayor of San Francisco are very, very shady. So the mayor before Dianne Feinstein, the mayor who was in office prior to Dianne Feinstein, was a man named George Moscone. And George Moscone was very much a kind of a Bernie Sanders Democrat, right? He was the mayor of San Francisco. He started out, this was the 70s. This was the, the hippie time where there was a lot of activism and an anti-war movement. And I don't think Moscone called himself a socialist, but he was definitely a left-wing fellow, and he was talking about guaranteed health care, and he was in with the labor unions, and he was a far-left guy. George Moscone was the mayor of San Francisco. And George Moscone had actually been, run against in the election. Dianne Feinstein had run against him from the right, saying that he was too far left. George Moscone had gotten elected mayor of San Francisco, and he had been aligned with another individual who was big in San Francisco's politics on the Board of Aldermen. That's what they call, the city council out there. They call it the Board of Aldermen. And another individual, that being Harvey Milk, the first openly gay elected official who was on the Board of Aldermen, was aligned with George Moscone. And they were in the government there in San Francisco, very liberal, very social democratic almost. Dianne Feinstein did not approve of them. They were too far left. They were too left-wing, too radical. But George Moscone and Harvey Milk, George Moscone, the liberal mayor of San Francisco, Harvey Milk, the first openly gay elected official on the Board of Aldermen, they were aligned with a very, very interesting individual by the name of Reverend Jim Jones, right? The Kool-Aid Man right? The strange apocalyptic cults of, the guy said he was the reincarnation of both Jesus and Lenin, and it was the People's Temple, and they were this big, strange kind of Christian socialist messianic weirdo cult that had a lot of power in San Francisco. And both Harvey Milk and George Moscone had entered a political alliance with Reverend Jim Jones, who, was a wacky cult, but he was calling himself a socialist, right? And so, you had kind of a far left-wing government in San Francisco, right? And Harvey Milk and George Moscone. George Moscone, from what I understand, ended up appointing Reverend Jim Jones to the board, to the housing board in San Francisco. And it was kind of, you could say like a far-left alliance where the labor unions, and the gay movement and the People's Temple, Reverend Jim Jones, kind of had power there. And they were kind of, social democrats, right? But they were pretty far left. And so scandals about Reverend Jim Jones began to surface, about some of the stuff he'd been doing and some of the sexual stuff that was going on in his cult. So Reverend Jim Jones and his followers fled San Francisco, and they moved to Guyana in South America, which at that point had a pro-Soviet government, kind of a Marxist government there in Guyana. They were out in the middle of the jungle. They had Jonestown, and they were all there. It was the Jonestown Agricultural Project. So they fled San Francisco. That was a key ally of Mayor George Moscone, and Harvey Milk got out of there when some of the sexual scandals and other things that were going on inside the People's Temple cult became revealed. So Reverend Jim Jones, out of the picture, he's in Guyana, right? And then we know what happened. Some senators, congressmen went down to Jonestown. Then they tried to leave. They were killed. And then all the Jonestown people, after the congressmen were killed, they all committed mass suicide. Right? A big incident. Like almost 1,000 people drank cyanide, killed themselves. This cult that had been key in getting Harvey Milk and Mayor George Moscone elected, they all committed suicide, right? The mass suicide, Jonestown, horrendous incident. Then shortly after that, a former member of the Board of Aldermen and a former police officer named Dan White, I believe, right? Dan White, if I'm correct, who was a former police officer, didn't like Harvey Milk, was a Democrat, didn't like Harvey Milk, didn't like George Moscone, walked into City Hall with a gun and shot George Moscone, the mayor, and he also shot the first gay elected official, Harvey Milk. So you had the mayor of San Francisco shot, you had the first gay elected official shot, and in the aftermath of that, then you had Dianne Feinstein she was next in line, sworn in to be the mayor of San Francisco. In the aftermath, a couple weeks after the Jonestown suicide, and then the mass suicide in Jonestown, you got two prominent elected officials who were aligned with Reverend Jim Jones. They get assassinated. And then Dianne Feinstein becomes mayor of San Francisco. And very famously, very, very famously, the individual, Dan White, who shot George Moscone and he shot Harvey Milk, he got the infamous, he got a very short sentence, like 2-3 years in prison, with the infamous Twinkie defense. The Twinkie defense, right? That he, was crazy and he was eating a lot of junk food. And they call it the Twinkie defense. And so this former police officer, member of the Board of Aldermen, didn't agree, Democrat, but did not agree with Moscone, did not agree with Harvey Milk, shoots the mayor, shoots a member of the Board of Aldermen, and then Dianne Feinstein walks into power and becomes the mayor of San Francisco. Do you want to talk about a shady, shady, shady background? That's how Dianne Feinstein became a prominent politician, right? She'd just been a member of the Board of Aldermen prior to that. But Dianne Feinstein's role as mayor of San Francisco, and now she's in the U.S. Senate, began with the mass suicide in Jonestown, the assassination of Harvey Milk and George Moscone, who she'd run against, and then in the aftermath of that, you had the individual who killed them, Dan White, getting a tiny sentence for killing the mayor of a city, and the Twinkie defense, and then you have a huge amount of rioting by the gay community, the White Night riots they called it, where they all went out and rioted in response to the short sentence given to the guy who shot Harvey Milk. It's all very, very shady. I'm not that old. I wasn't in San Francisco during the 1970s, obviously. It sounds like a pretty scary place. A lot of confusion going on there. It was a very, very, very strange thing. And Kinky throws in, that Dan White then killed himself shortly afterwards. Really, really strange, right? We're talking 1978, San Francisco politics, a kind of what almost somebody looking at this might even say it was like a mini coup d'etat, where, like the far left government, this alliance between Reverend Jim Jones and certain trade unions and George Moscone and the gay rights activists, they were running San Francisco. And then, the cult kills themselves in a mass suicide, and then a former police officer shoots them, and then you have Dianne Feinstein running the San Francisco Democratic Party. That's very, very, very shady. Dianne Feinstein's history, I mean, I hope that at some point more information comes out. I hope that there's more revelations about what exactly was going on there. That is really shady, right? I mean, the Jonestown incident is really bizarre. When I was in school, they would always talk to us about Jonestown, and you almost got the impression they would say, oh, it's a cult, but the whole communist angle, they never really played it up. And I always thought that was weird, because you would think that if you wanted to attack communism, you'd just say, look, this crazy Reverend Jim Jones, killer, he was a communist. See how evil communism is. Well, he wasn't really a communist. I guess he claimed he was kind of a communist. He also claimed he was a Christian, and he was the reincarnation of Jesus, and it was a strange moment. That whole thing was really, really strange. That moment in 1978 when Dianne Feinstein emerged in the middle of political chaos, with the mayor being assassinated, with the first gay elected official being assassinated, with the Jonestown massacre of this crazy cult that had been key. The whole thing was really strange. So Dianne Feinstein is a very, very shady figure, right? That's all I got to say about that. Dianne Feinstein, she should give you the willies, as they say. She should make you nervous, because, she emerged in the middle of a strange, strange political cauldron of events that is very, very shady, with a lot of people dying and a lot of confusion and a lot of rioting and a lot of shady activities. That's all I got to say about that. Dianne Feinstein's emergence to power was pretty strange. So the fact that she wasn't nice to a group of kids, does that surprise me? Not particularly. She's always rubbed me the wrong way. Now, people talk about her husband being a Wall Street guy, being a billionaire, and his financial connections. From what I understand, her husband is also very much a supporter of the Tibetan separatist movement. He's put a lot of money into promoting, trying to break Tibet away from the rest of China. And that's worth looking into as well. But Dianne Feinstein is an interesting character. She wasn't very nice to the kids who supported the Green New Deal, to say the least, right? She wasn't exactly upfront and friendly and thanking them for working hard to be so nice, even though she didn't agree with them. So there you go. That is some shady history there, and no one ever talks about it. Now Kinky is throwing out, how did she get reelected in 2017? Yeah, from what I understand, the California Democratic Party didn't endorse her, right? And that there's a long history. I mean, Dianne Feinstein really, just like Hillary Clinton, she really reeks of that corrupt political machine. It's like you can talk about the two parties and their weaknesses, right? The Republican Party and the Democratic Party, their history says a lot about them. The Democratic Party started out, it was New York City and New England, and it was Thomas Jefferson, and it was some of the founders of the United States in urban areas. It was the urban areas, right? We had Tammany Hall in New York City, the Tammany Hall machine, which is still very much alive. The New York City Democratic Party has quite a reputation, Boss Tweed, and just kind of the urban political machines. That was the Democratic Party, right? And then later, with the decline of the Whig Party and all that, you have rural folks, rural farmers, what they called the free soilers, the rural folks. They started the Republican Party. They were opposed to slavery. They were opposed to big business and the labor unions and the farmers and the free soilers, the farmers who didn't believe in slavery, the small farmers. They formed the Republican Party. And the Democratic Party, it's gone through a lot of leaps and evolutions in what it believes, but it's always been the party of urban political machines, which are notoriously corrupt, right? Urban politics is far more corrupt than local politics in the USA, right? And, people talk about dead people voting for Kennedy, and how did Truman get reelected when the Democratic vote was split three ways, and that urban folks, urban politics is defined by the Democrats, and rural, non-urban, folks in, Midwestern states, they tend to be Republican, right? And originally, the Republicans were the left-wing party. Why? Because where do you think they got the name Republican from? That was the Republic, the French Revolution, right? Their slogan was free land, free labor, free men. Anti-slavery, they were the party of the labor unions and the small farmers, and they opposed slavery. They were for abolition of slavery. They were religious, but like it was like John Brown religious, right? They were radicals. They were for the common people, and they didn't like the slave owners and the big bankers on Wall Street that were in with them, and they were radicals. And they were rural folks, and they tended to be very, very religious, but their religious ideology was tied in with that. The Democrats tended to be the more conservative party associated with corrupt political machines and also with the slave owners, the plantation owners of the South, right? And that, even though the North was obviously anti-slavery, New York City during the Civil War was a hotbed of pro-slavery sentiments because Wall Street made a lot of money insuring those ships full of cotton that were going to Britain so the British could make their textile industry grow with the cheap cotton picked by slaves in the U.S. South. And that a lot of Wall Street bankers saw slavery and the Southern slave plantation system and its exports around the world as a way to make a lot of money. And so, it was the Democratic Party was the party of the South and slavery. It was the party of corrupt urban machines in the North. The Republican Party was the party of deeply religious farmers and small farmers and rural folks. And, the Democratic Party's weakness, and still to this day, its weakness is that it's viewed as corrupt, right? It's a party associated with political machines and people being bribed and all of the corruption of urban politics in the United States. And the Republican Party's weakness, and it was their weakness at the beginning, and I'd say it's still their weakness to this day, is there's an element of fanaticism about them. Now, obviously, being a fanatical abolitionist and wanting to abolish slavery is a great thing. Being a fanatic is about some things is very good. I'm all in favor of fanaticism. But the Republican Party, that's always been, they've always been a little bit too enthusiastic about their beliefs for most Americans. Now, fast forward a few, 100 years or so, and it gets a little bit weird, right? So you got Woodrow Wilson, right? And he did Birth of a Nation, that racist Hollywood movie, the first full-length movie ever made. And the Democrats around the time of, the early 1900s and lead up to World War I, their main talking point was racism. They said that they were for the common man or whatever, but it was on the basis of racism. And in the hopes of trying to recruit some of those small farmers and stuff and expand their power and kind of push the Republican Party out, the Democratic Party really started playing up the idea that the Republican Party was a party of African Americans, and it gave government jobs to African Americans, and it was just awful. And the movie Birth of a Nation, which was a Democratic Party project, was shown everywhere, and Woodrow Wilson was showing it everywhere. He had it shown at the White House. His writings are actually shown on the screen, and it's playing up the idea of basically white nationalism. The Democratic Party of the 1920s and prior, it was, they were white nationalists, white supremacists, very much so. I mean, very blatantly. You watch Birth of a Nation, that was a white supremacist film, and it's the birth of a nation because after the gap of the Civil War, the whites of the North and the whites of the South are joining arm in arm it's a really racist, basically, essentially a white nationalist film. And that's the Democratic Party. But there's kind of a, weird populist edge to it. Like they're for the common man and all that, but it's racist. And the Republican Party is still the party of rural folks. And then the Republican Party, and this is where it gets interesting, right? They become the champions of prohibition, banning alcohol. And why are they big supporters of prohibition? Well, these rural folks, these farmers, they're Protestants. And Protestants back then, most Protestants did not approve of the drinking of alcohol. Nowadays, obviously, most Protestant Christians have no problem with drinking alcohol. But back then, the rural, farmers that were Republicans that had been the left-wing party, the party of Lincoln, the party that the Democrats were constantly accusing of being a party supporting black people, and that was racist. The Democrats were racist, and they were accusing them of being sympathetic to African Americans as if there was something wrong with that. Well, the Republican Party, they became the champions of prohibition, outlawing the drinking of alcohol, and you got that going on. Right? And the small farmers, the Protestants, didn't like the fact that there were a lot of immigrants coming into the United States, into urban areas, that's where the immigrants were going, from Ireland, from Italy, from Eastern Europe, who were Catholic, and they drank alcohol. Right? So the rural Protestants, the farmers, they did not believe in drinking alcohol. And these wave of immigrants from Ireland, from Eastern Europe, from Italy, they did believe in drinking alcohol. And so you had prohibition being like a Republican policy. These small town farmers, they thought that was sinful, alcohol drinking, and oh, they didn't approve of that. Fast forward, you got Roosevelt comes in, and Roosevelt, he kind of a Bonapartist and has an alliance with the Communist Party, and, his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, is making anti-racist statements, though Roosevelt is always hesitant because they talk about the quote-unquote solid South of Jim Crow segregationists that are racist, and Roosevelt's always trying to, balance between being aligned with the communists, who are the most progressive, anti-racist forces, and being, having this alliance with the Jim Crow South. And so Roosevelt is kind of caught, there, and he's trying to balance it. And often his wife is doing anti-racist things, and Roosevelt is keeping his mouth shut. Vito Marcantonio, who was a sympathizer with the Communist Party, is elected as a congressman from Harlem. He's always introducing an anti-lynching bill, a federal anti-lynching bill that would end lynching, and it would institute the death penalty for lynching. And it's like, and he's proposing that. And every time he puts forward this anti-lynching bill, the Democrats and the Republicans vote it down, right? And the communists are trying to talk against Jim Crow. The Republicans don't really oppose Jim Crow, but the left wing of the Democratic Party, the communist socialist wing of the Democratic Party, is opposing Jim Crow segregation. And that's basically where you start to have kind of a reversal, right? And then after the Second World War and the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement, and you have the northern wing of the Democratic Party getting the upper hand, and the Kennedy family, and eventually, you have the Republicans taking over the South because the Democratic Party becomes a party that's supporting the Civil Rights Act and opposing segregation and all of that, right? It's very complicated. And let's not forget that Lyndon Johnson, who is Kennedy's vice presidential candidate, his running mate, he was from Texas. And he was a right-winger in many ways. And he was, he had a nickname. They used to call him Lynching Baines Johnson instead of Lyndon Johnson because he was so much seen as a segregationist. But lo and behold, he's the one who came in there and signed the Voting Rights Act and was pushing forward a lot of the key civil rights legislation, because it's not about good guys and bad guys. It's about the movement, right? There was a huge movement in the streets for civil rights. There was a section of the ruling class that thought that Jim Crow segregation was hurting the United States and hurting its credibility around the world, and that the Soviet Union was using the black question to undermine the USA, and so there was a section of the U.S. ruling class that said, look, we got to get rid of Jim Crow segregation, and there was a big clash. Right, and Kennedy came in, seen as an ally of the civil rights movement. He appointed his vice as Lyndon Johnson, who was seen as, it was accommodating the Jim Crow Dixiecrat wing of the Democratic Party. And lo and behold, Lyndon Johnson, who had been known as Lynching Baines Johnson, not a nice guy, ended up signing the civil rights legislation. Lyndon Johnson, the more you read about that guy, I got to say, here's a little anecdote about Lyndon Johnson, right? Lyndon Johnson was at one point, he was a principal at a school, from what I understand, where a lot of the people were Chicanos who did not speak English. He was in Texas, an area in Texas, a lot of Chicanos. He taught a school of all, Chicano, Latino young people. And he instituted a policy at this school, I guess, and this was apparently very common at one time, of not allowing any student at this school to speak Spanish. And the penalty for speaking Spanish was he would, paddle them. He would, spank them or whatever if they spoke Spanish. And he instituted this policy. And he was known for being, if you read biographies of Lyndon Johnson, he was just a ruthless guy in applying this and just beating children for speaking the language that they spoke in their household. Just horrendous. And he was notoriously sadistic with these young people, according to some biographies. I mean, that's who the man was. I mean, he was very much associated with segregation. But then again, it's like his reputation, because later when he became president, he had the Great Society program, and I guess there was like a tornado someplace, and he went out with a bullhorn and said, I am your president, and I'm here to help you. I mean, he kind of reversed his image, right? Even though he had been this Jim Crow racist guy who beat, Chicano and Latino students for speaking their own language, when he was president, he was associated with the Great Society and the expansion of the welfare state. And, his reputation, now he has this reputation as being just a good friend of African Americans, a good friend of Latinos. It shows how weird American politics really is. American politics is really, really, really weird, right? And that people, they leap, they evolve, they change. But, what was done to the Chicano nation and the way their language was literally beaten out of them. I mean, there's a whole history of that. I mean, they talk about, when England was colonizing Wales, right? And you're going way back. I mean, you're talking, long, long time ago. The way that they essentially tried to suppress the Welsh language is in the schools they would have a thing called a Welsh knot. And it was a knot that you would wear around your neck. And if a teacher saw a student speaking Welsh, they would have to wear the knot around their neck. But then, if that student saw another student speaking Welsh, they could put the knot around their neck. And so whoever had the Welsh knot around their neck at the end of the day got a beating. So the idea was the kid with the knot really wants to get the knot off of his neck, so he's looking for any other kid who would speak Welsh. It was pretty horrendous. And that's done to nations historically. When nations are being oppressed, the idea of preventing the kids from speaking their language. It's kind of like what was done to Native Americans too, right? The Indian schools that were notorious, where the Native Americans were taken from their parents, forced to board at Indian schools, and the slogan that they used being, quote, "Kill the Indian, save the man," just horrendous stuff. And when you're trying to destroy, a nation, when you're trying to destroy a culture, you keep kids from speaking their own language. And Jonathan James is talking about how speaking in Gaelic was illegal in Scotland. Absolutely true. There's a whole history of that, not letting people speak their own language. And it was because of this that the Bolsheviks, when they took power in the Soviet Union, one of the first things they did is start promoting the languages of oppressed nations within the Soviet Union, right? There would be no Ukrainian language if it were not for the Soviet Union. All of these Ukrainian separatists who want to hate on the Soviet Union, it was because of the Soviet Union, because the Soviet government went out of its way to promote the languages of oppressed nationalities in the former Tsarist Empire. It's because of them that there's a written language of Ukraine. The Soviet government bent over backwards to promote Ukrainian national identity, along with Georgian national identity, along with Belarusian national identity. In fact, a lot of Russians criticize the Soviet Union because of this, because it bent over backwards to promote different nationalities within the USSR. In fact, in the early years of the USSR, they eventually got rid of it, but for a while, they had a house of nationalities, right? They had the Supreme Soviet, which was based on population, but in the government, they had a house of nationalities where every nation was promoted, right? I know in the Soviet Union, they set up the Jewish Autonomous Region, the JAR, so that the Jewish people in the USSR who felt that Jews were a nation would have a territory of their own. And in fact, to this day, the largest menorah in the entire world is not in Israel. It's in the Jewish Autonomous Region that once existed in the USSR. So, the Soviet Union, they really bent over backwards to try and reverse these policies. And that was just a gross aspect of that era, where nations are taking over other nations, and the colonizing nation just tries to just destroy the language, destroy the culture, destroy the history of the other nation. It's just a horrendous thing. And Lyndon Johnson was doing it. The British, everybody. And the Bolsheviks and the Soviet Union. Lenin was obsessed with the national question. That was one of his obsessions. And that was one of his key differences with Karl Marx. Marx said, all nationalism is inherently reactionary. Workers of the world unite. Right? That was Karl Marx. But Lenin said, no, there are oppressed nations and oppressor nations, and you should support an oppressed nation in fighting for its independence and fighting for its national liberation against an oppressor nation. That was a key aspect of Leninism, and why Leninism was a split from classical Marxism, was because Leninism is about supporting oppressed nations, right? And a lot of Russians feel like they went overboard with it. They went too far with it. And I would say that black nationalism as a movement, it got a real kickstart because of the USSR. There was black nationalism prior to the USSR. They didn't invent it. But when they came out with the thesis, the Black Belt thesis of the Communist International, that basically said that the descendants of slaves in the United States represented a colonized people within U.S. borders. And the Communist International called for the independence of the Black Belt. They wanted to break away the parts of the United States that were majority black at that time in the 1920s and 30s. And they wanted to create an independent black Soviet republic. People don't even know that was actually one of the demands of the Communist Party. That was part of their platform. In the elections, they had election campaign posters on the slogan of independence for the Black Belt, self-determination for the African-American people, right? That was a big part of being a communist in the 1920s and 30s. It wasn't that you were just against racism. They were against racism. It was more than that. They were saying that black people are a nation and they have a right to their own national territory, right? There should be, the black people have the right to separate from the United States and form their own country. That was a big part of communist ideology. And there are some criticisms there, right? The Communist Party was a majority white organization. And you have to admit, there were probably times where people, if you have a group of white people going around and saying to black people, we want you all to be your own country, it sounds almost like segregation, right? So maybe it wasn't strategic, but a lot of black intellectuals and writers and thinkers associated with the Communist Party on the basis of their support for black nationalism, right? On the Black Belt thesis. Right? This idea that black people constitute a colonized people. They're just like the Irish. They're just like the people in the developing world who've been conquered by the French or the English. The black people are a colonized people within U.S. borders. That was a big belief of the Communist Party. And in fact, Malcolm X's dad, Kinky's bringing up Malcolm X's dad. Now, Malcolm X's dad was, I believe, associated with Marcus Garvey and the Back to Africa movement. And he was killed, from what I understand, by the Black Legion, which was a fascist group that operated in Detroit in Michigan. Marcus Garvey, he was not a communist by any means. He very much, opposed communism. He was very much he believed in black capitalism and all that. But the Communist Party supported Marcus Garvey on some level. They didn't support him all out, but they supported Marcus Garvey. There's a very good book you can read called Black Bolshevik, and it's written by Harry Haywood, who was one of the most prominent African-American leaders of the Communist Party of the United States during the 1930s. And he goes into great detail about how the Communist Party supported black nationalism. That was one of their main points. And a lot of black intellectuals started to support the Communist Party because of that. Langston Hughes being one of them. Langston Hughes was a big supporter of the Communist Party. Paul Robeson was a big supporter. Claudia Jones, who was a Caribbean-American activist who was eventually deported. She ended up living the rest of her life in Britain. She was deported from the USA because she was Caribbean-born, and she was a black activist in the USA who was a communist. They ended up kicking her out of the country. And it's weird because when Earl Browder, the grandfather of a certain Bill Browder, when Earl Browder came into leadership of the Communist Party, he didn't like the Black Belt thesis. He said, oh no, we can't have that, right? We can't be for an independent black nation. We can't be supporting people like Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam and Marcus Garvey. That's too radical. So he dropped it. He dropped the Black Belt thesis, right? And after the Second World War, Earl Browder was kicked out of the Communist Party, and William Z. Foster and a lot of the rank and file of the Communist Party rose up against Earl Browder and his corrupt political machine that had been really holding back the Communist Party and, really had them take some really awful positions during the Second World War. Like Earl Browder supported Japanese internment. I don't know how any communist could support Japanese internment, but Earl Browder supported it, said it was necessary for the war effort. They basically sent a letter to all their black members and said, hey, or all their Japanese members, said, hey, comply with the internment, go to the internment camps. That's pretty awful, right? I mean, the Communist Party during the Second World War, it was right to support the Second World War, a war against fascism, but Earl Browder's political machine that was really corrupt and really tied in with the Democratic Party and all of that, they really took supporting the Second World War to some pretty extreme lengths. And after the Second World War, a lot of the really dedicated communists in the party, like William Z. Foster, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, Claudia Jones, others, they rose up against Earl Browder. Earl Browder, they found an opening because Earl Browder hadn't supported the Cold War. He basically wanted to take the position that U.S. imperialism was not the main enemy. And Earl Browder was not willing to start, opposing U.S. imperialism as the Cold War began. When the Soviet Union and the USA stopped being allies at the end of Second World War, Earl Browder couldn't have it. He was not willing to take pro-Soviet positions in the Cold War. So when that happened, William Z. Foster and Elizabeth Gurley Flynn and others, they created an opening, and they toppled Earl Browder from the leadership of the Communist Party USA. A very glorious moment, the anti-Browder campaign. And when that happened, one of the first things that they did was restore the Black Belt thesis and once again start supporting black nationalism. And you can read articles by Claudia Jones and others talking about how one of Earl Browder's biggest crimes was the fact that he didn't support black nationalism. And it wasn't really until the death of Stalin and until the rise of Khrushchev that they ultimately dropped from the Communist Party platform the support for black nationalism. And the Communist Party switched its position and started supporting the civil rights movement and opposing black nationalism. That didn't happen until 1956, really. And that was after the death of Stalin. It was with Khrushchev, and there was a shift, and the world was changing. And oddly, what's interesting is that Mao and the Chinese Communist Party, when they were distinguishing themselves from the Soviets after the Sino-Soviet split, they started supporting black nationalism, right? And Mao, it's not widely known today, but Mao actually welcomed a very well-known black freedom fighter to China. Robert F. Williams was a leader of the NAACP in Monroe, North Carolina. Robert F. Williams. And Robert F. Williams, very famously, he armed his local chapter of the NAACP. They were marching, protesting, demanding the integration of swimming pools. The Klan wasn't having it, was shooting at them and killing them. And he wrote a book called Negroes with Guns, advocating the right of African Americans to armed self-defense. And he got into a shootout with the Ku Klux Klan, and he fled the country. And where did he go? To China to meet with Mao Zedong. And the Chinese Communist Party put out a statement supporting black nationalism and supporting Robert F. Williams, the leader of this NAACP group that took up arms to fight the Ku Klux Klan. Very fascinating. And again, that seemed to be one of the positions. When China and the Soviet Union were not getting along, one of the differences, we're talking the 60s, the Khrushchev era, one of the differences between the Maoists and the pro-Soviet parties was that the pro-Soviet U.S. Communist Party supported Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, whereas the Maoists supported Malcolm X, and they supported black nationalism. And there was a big difference there. It's very fascinating. This is all fascinating history. I feel like a lot of this has been lost. That was one of the big differences, and that's why Mao was considered to be more revolutionary. The Maoists in China were supporting Malcolm X, and the Communist Party USA was supporting, Dr. Martin Luther King. Very fascinating stuff. I bet, but, it was very fascinating stuff. There's a lot of fascinating history there with how communists relate to the black question. Is it a national question? Is it a question simply of discrimination? Very fascinating stuff. Now, I'm getting a lot of questions thrown at me. During the 1993 Communist Revolt, did the Yeltsin loyalist troops really gun down? I actually don't know enough about that, Tim. Now, someone's pointing out that the SWP also supported Malcolm X, and that is absolutely true. And in fact, from what I understand, the writings of Malcolm X, like his actual writings, not the autobiography that was actually written by Alex Haley, right? And there's some weird stuff going on with that. Look into the history of that book that everyone's read it. Well, not everyone's read it, but it's available widely in the USA. Very widely available. The book, The Autobiography of Malcolm X, as told to Alex Haley. It's not actually written by Malcolm X. It's written by Alex Haley, the guy who wrote Roots. And it was edited by Harvey Braverman, who was kind of a Trotskyist, and he worked for a publishing company. And from what we understand, it's reported widely that the FBI was involved in editing that book and in editing the autobiography of Malcolm X, right? And that there's a lot of content that was cut out at the request of the FBI because the publishing company and Harvey Braverman and Alex Haley, they sat down with the FBI, and the FBI went over the autobiography of Malcolm X and cut out a bunch of stuff. And keep in mind, it's the autobiography of Malcolm X as told to Alex Haley. Alex Haley, the guy who wrote Roots, sat down with Malcolm X and did extensive interviews with Malcolm X, sat down with him, and then he wrote a book, right? So that's not the voice of Malcolm X you're hearing when you read that book. You're hearing the voice of Alex Haley. That book is everywhere. But the actual writings of Malcolm X, right? The writings, the speeches of Malcolm X, Malcolm X talks to young people, Malcolm X on black nationalism, That stuff, very interestingly, is the copyright of it is still owned by the Socialist Workers' Party. The Trotskyites, they actually own the rights to print it. Pathfinder Press. They are the ones that actually, have the rights to distribute it. They were sold the rights to Malcolm X's actual writings by Malcolm X's widow, Betty Shabazz. So very, very interesting history there. But yes, the SWP also supported Malcolm X to the point that the SWP even had Malcolm X as a speaker at their forums. He spoke at militant labor forums. That was forums sponsored by the Socialist Workers' Party called the Militant Labor Forums. And there's a speech online you can listen to of Malcolm X speaking to a group of Trotskyites. It's very fascinating. A lot of fascinating history there. But yeah, the Communist Party USA, they did not like Malcolm X because he was a black nationalist. And they were in favor of Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement. And the Trotskyites and the Maoists were supporters of black nationalism. The Communist Party had supported black nationalism during the time of Stalin. They'd gotten rid of it under Earl Browder, then they'd restored it after the Second World War was over, and then after the death of Stalin and the rise of Khrushchev and the 1956 political crisis in the Communist Party, then they dropped their support for black nationalism. Very interesting. Another really good book to read would be Nelson Peary's autobiography, Black Radical, because he was in the Communist Party when he was in the Communist Party when they had their split and over the question of the black belt. Just fascinating, fascinating stuff. But what else is going on, folks? What else is happening? My iPhone is acting really weird, and I'm sorry that the quality of the image you're getting is not what it usually is. It's usually better than this, but unfortunately, it's a strange night. But I thank you for joining me anyway, even though I'm streaming here. I know that there's a lot of us here tonight, and I think we're having a good chat. But yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating history there of how do you relate to the black question in the USA? Is it a national question? Is it a question just of discrimination? And the communist approach was originally a national question approach. And oddly, the Socialist Party of the United States, Eugene Debs had always opposed racism, but the Socialist Party of the United States had a lot of open racists in it. And when the Communist Party was being formed, their opposition to racism was one of their key factors. It was actually one of their key factors because that was one of the things that separated them from other socialist trends. It's very fascinating, very, very fascinating stuff. Steve O'Awesome says, thank you for recommending The History of the Three Internationals on Facebook a few months ago. Very informative book. Today I started reading The Governance of China. Quite interesting so far. Well, thank you, Steve O'Awesome. I really do recommend William Z. Foster's The History of the Three Internationals. That is a really good book. I think Red Star Publishers has picked it up. You can buy it, but it was long out of print. And it's William Z. Foster, who was the leader of the U.S. Communist Party in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. He was an old man. He was basically retired, and he started writing, history books. He wrote A History of the Communist Party USA. He wrote A History of the World Trade Union Movement. He wrote The History of the history of Black Americans. He wrote the outline political history of the Americas, but he also wrote this really, really good book called The History of the Three Internationals. Not the most exciting title, right? You hear the name and you go, oh boy, The History of the Three Internationals. I just want to, it sounds boring. It's really exciting. The book starts with, the aftermath of the French Revolution and Karl Marx and the origins of the Marxist movement. And from there, it goes all the way up into the aftermath of the Second World War. And it takes you the entire history of Marxism. The First International, led by Karl Marx, where he fought it out with the anarchists, and the anarchists ultimately wrecked it, and Karl Marx got kicked out of his own organization. The Second International, which is still around today, that's the British Labour Party, that's the Democratic Socialists of America, that's the French Socialist Party, that's, the mainstream social democratic parties. The Third International, that's the Comintern, the Communist International the Bolsheviks formed and ultimately dissolved. The Soviet Union dissolved it during the Second World War. Yeah, it's that history, right? From the First International to the Second International to the Third International. If you want to understand Marxism, you got to read that book because it gets into the debates. Why did Karl Marx not agree with the anarchists? What was the fight with Bernstein about? All the arguments that are going on today. Right? People argue about this or that. Should we support this political figure? Should we support that one? All the arguments that went on in the history of Marxism, that have happened before, pretty much, right? I mean, and maybe, I'm not saying the way they're resolved, it's not like there's a permanent answer. But you can read about, and especially William Z. Foster, because he's from the United States, gives very, very special attention to the history of the United States. And he talks extensively about Karl Marx's support for Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War. He talks extensively about the fighting within the Socialist Party and the debates about the formation of trade unions in the United States. And I mean, he really gets into great detail. The History of the Three Internationals by William Z. Foster. If you want to understand the history of the global communist movement, you've got to read The History of the Three Internationals. It's a very, very good book. And when I was reading that book, that's when I first started to grasp Marxism. Prior to reading that book, I basically had thought of Marxism almost like magic, right? It's like, well, I'm going to say the right magic words and we're going to have the correct ideology and everything will work out. When I started reading that book in 2010, right after, Obama got elected and as things were getting ready for the Occupy crisis, I read The History of the Three Internationals and I started thinking like a Marxist. And I started to understand the difference between utopian socialism and scientific socialism and Marxism. And I started to understand how even though Abraham Lincoln was not a communist or a socialist, even though a lot of the forces aligned with Abraham Lincoln were awful and racist, why Karl Marx had supported Abraham Lincoln and strategically made that alliance. And I started to understand the debates that had gone on within the Communist International, within the Second International, and I really started to think in a more scientific way about politics. This isn't religion, right? This isn't like the holy book of Marx says that on page 3 we shall never join the Democrat. That's, when I started to read The History of the Three Internationals by William Z. Foster, where he explains everything. He explains everything as if you don't know anything. So much Marxist stuff is written in this very highfalutin terminology. It assumes that you know stuff, right? And it's like the emperor's new clothes, because half the people listening don't know what you're talking about, but you don't explain it, and they don't ask, and they pretend they know, and it's a joke. But William Z. Foster, his writing was written as if you don't know any of this, as if you have no clue about anything to do with Marxism. He explains it all. It's brilliant stuff. If you want to understand the Marxist worldview, you've got to read The History of the Three Internationals by William Z. Foster. I recommend that book wholeheartedly, right? I really do. That book is, I'm not saying it has all the answers. It's written in the 50s. But if you want to understand, these kind of issues, if you want to understand how Marxists and scientific socialists think, you got to read that book. Very, very good stuff. Written like a textbook almost. Very clear. The point is for you to understand the ideas. You're not supposed to be impressed with how smart the author is. But what else is on people's minds? What are my thoughts, Ramiro is asking me, on the candidates for 2020? Well, Kamala Harris makes me sick. Kamala Harris makes me sick, right? Look at that clip that's on there of her making fun of people who protest, saying more money for education and less for schools. It is sickening, right? Kamala Harris with her Russiagate conspiracy theories, with her contempt for Bernie Sanders, with her career as a prosecutor, a lock-em-up woman who tried to jail people who were innocent on the grounds they didn't prove their innocence soon enough. Just a sick woman. A woman, when there was a child prostitution scandal inside the Oakland Police Department, refused to bring state charges, refused to go in and go after them, was very happy to put away a lot of African-American folks for petty crimes. Just an awful, awful woman. And now she's on there claiming that she smoked weed when she was in college and she listened to rap music and she doesn't even have the dates right on the rap music. Awful, awful human being. Kamala Harris makes me sick. She makes me sick. I swear. I'm not going to endorse people and all of that. The other thing that's worth noting, and I know Jimmy Dore and others have been talking about this, is... have you noticed that Bernie Sanders, he raised that huge amount of money when he started. According to polls, he was more likely to beat Trump than Hillary Clinton was. But yet, ever since he's announced his campaign, there's just been a huge amount of just bashing him right? Washington Post is running all these articles saying, oh, he has no chance. CNN, we got a CNN anchor saying that the Bernie Sanders base, they're bad because they're, quote, whiter and younger, right? I mean, this is crazy, right? I mean, I've never seen, Bernie Sanders is wildly popular among Democrats, but yet the media has gone into an overdrive saying he has no chance of getting the nomination, right? I mean, it's like a foregone conclusion. Bernie will not get it. And Tulsi Gabbard, they're leaving her name out. When they list female people running for president, they're leaving out Tulsi Gabbard's name, right? NBC, I mean, the campaign's barely started, and NBC's already accusing Tulsi Gabbard's campaign of being a Russian troll and bot operation, right? It's pretty clear they don't want Bernie Sanders to be the nominee. They don't want Tulsi Gabbard to be the nominee. So that's pretty clear. There's no ambiguity about it. NBC, Fox, and all of that, they know who they don't want. They don't like Bernie, and they don't like Tulsi Gabbard. I'll say that much. They don't. Elizabeth Warren, they could stomach, right? I don't think she would ever have a chance of winning, but I think they could stomach Elizabeth Warren. I think they could definitely stomach Kamala Harris. At the end of the day, though, folks, I think that my prediction is unless the economy crashes, or unless the Democrats actually nominate somebody who's far left and radical sounding like Tulsi Gabbard or Bernie Sanders, that Trump will be reelected. He's already started building his wall. He did the national emergency. People don't like the establishment. The establishment clearly doesn't like Trump. And, unless the Democrats nominate a firebrand, someone who's anti-establishment of their own, I think it's just going to be a given that they're gonna vote for Trump. I think given if the economy were to crash, right? And a lot of people are predicting that, right? And Wall Street was doing pretty well, but then there was a pretty big shakeup. If there was like another crash, I think that Trump could definitely lose. When Trump said that this is an economic miracle in the United States, those words could come back to haunt him, right? All they have to do is roll that tape whenever the economy is going bad, when people start losing their jobs, losing their homes, they could roll that tape. So again, I'm predicting at this point, with things looking the way they are, with the economy doing okay, not an economic miracle, but it's not a huge downturn, right? Wages are still dropping, conditions are getting worse, but overall, hey, there's low unemployment and Wall Street's doing great. With those circumstances, with the Democrats not likely to nominate somebody who's going to inspire their base and really fire up their people and really appear to be anti-establishment, in those circumstances, I think we can count on another 4 years of Trump. I think it's almost a foregone conclusion. If things stay the way they are right now, if the Democratic Party machine that rigged it for Hillary Clinton last time, rigged it against Bernie, rigs it again, if the Democratic Party machine nominates a lamestream liberal, if the economy doesn't crash, I think Trump's going to get reelected. That's my prediction, right? But what do I know, right? I'm just some guy. I'm just a reporter. I'm just somebody who talks to prominent political people, and haha. But there you go. So, that's my prediction. But hey, world events move at a very, very rapid pace, right? They move at a very, very rapid pace these days. Anything could happen. I am really nervous about what's going on the Venezuelan border. That's not good, right? I mean, things could really escalate. So, we don't know what could happen, honestly. We really don't know what could happen. So, it's very possible that maybe the Democrats, they figure, okay, we rigged it last time, But another thing I got to mention is Howard Schultz, the Starbucks billionaire. Ooh, right? Look at that. So he's saying he's going to run as a third-party candidate. But if the Democrats nominate a centrist like Kamala Harris, he'll pull out of the race, right? The Starbucks man, the low-wage barista man, right? The coffee chain billionaire, the big supporter of Israel, right? Howard Schultz says the Democrats are too far left. Free healthcare is just not feasible. He likes identity politics. He likes anti-racist trainings. He has anti-racist trainings at Starbucks. But Bernie Sanders and this stuff is just too far left. So if the Democrats nominate someone who's far left, he's gonna run in the race too, just to take votes away from them and make sure that Trump wins. Right? Classy fellow. Classy guy, right? Shows you that Howard Schultz may say he hates Trump, but deep down, Howard Schultz hates Bernie Sanders and the far left far more than he hates Trump. Right? That's really what he's saying. When he's announcing that if the Democrats nominate someone who is far left, he will run against them, and he'll split the Democratic vote. What's he saying there? He's saying, I'd rather have Trump than Bernie, right? And then you got to ask yourself, right? He says his selling point is he's anti-racist, and he's anti-sexist, and he's pro-choice, and he's pro-LGBT. He just doesn't believe in social democracy and socialism. If that's the case, why is he more afraid of Bernie winning? Why is he willing to fix the race to make sure that Bernie doesn't win and get Trump reelected, right? Why is he more opposed to Sanders than Trump? That's what he's saying, right? That's what he's saying. There's no two ways about it, right? Howard Schultz, right? Howard Schultz would rather have Donald Trump than Bernie Sanders. So how in the world can he claim that he's this super politically correct, anti-sexist, anti-racist, anti-transphobe, anti-homophobe? How can he be that if he'd rather have Trump, who doesn't agree with him on those issues, who he deems to be racist and anti-immigrant? How can he say that he is all of those things if you'd rather have Trump for 4 more years than have Bernie, right? That it sounds like he's not very committed to those liberal causes that he gives lip service to. That's what it sounds like to me. You know, but look, in both parties right now, I mean, and yes, people are saying that Bernie Sanders is not really that far left, and they're absolutely right, especially on foreign policy. I mean, he was a big supporter of the bombing of Serbia. We know that, 1999. You know, Tulsi Gabbard is far more anti-imperialist, you know, and that Bernie Sanders, but his economic populism really hits home with a lot of people. He's for health care for all, education for all. He's really, he's really running on a populist, social democratic, not really social democratic, but populist program, economic populism, expanding the welfare state, better life for working families. He's running on that platform. And the center, here's the thing. Trump isn't really a fascist, right? Trump is, he's a conservative. He's he's for a bigger police state. He's kind of a right-wing populist, but he's not a fascist, right? If he was a fascist, I'd be in a prison camp right now. He's not a fascist, right? He's done a lot of things I don't like and agree with. Not a fascist. Bernie Sanders, not really a socialist, right? He says that his vision of democratic socialism is not contrary to capitalism. Well, he says that socialism just kind of means more welfare programs. So Bernie Sanders isn't really a socialist. Donald Trump isn't really a fascist. But what's happening here is that the political center, the liberal order, is fighting for its life because people are unsatisfied. So more and more people within the liberal order are sounding more like socialists, more like fascists, because the liberal order itself, the liberal order of the Western world, which is free market capitalism combined with, at the same time, social liberalism and you can do what you want. It's your life. It's your own business, right? That the right wing plays up the social and cultural conservatism, nationalism, religion, all of that. The left plays up economic, or plays up, what do you call it? They play up more cultural liberal stuff, but at the same time, they're not going to fight against free markets. And at the end of the day, right, this liberal order is starting to fall, right? The liberal order on the right is free markets. The liberal order on the left is cultural liberalism. And it's starting to fall. People are tired of it, right? That political formula of, neoliberal economics and socially liberal, cultural policies, legalize gay marriage, but at the same time, privatize things and cut people's spending and lower the wages, cut government spending, not guaranteeing people free markets and free economics, free markets and free social liberalism. That people are tired of it. They really are. And it's fighting for its life. And so it's very much presenting figures that sound more like things outside of it. Trump sounds like some kind of right-wing nationalist conservative. Bernie Sanders sounds like some kind of socialist. But Bernie Sanders isn't really a socialist at the end of the day, and Trump isn't really a fascist at the end of the day. Both of them are for preserving the liberal order. They just interpret it to mean different things. That's important to note, and that needs to be said. So someone's saying Bernie Sanders is a social democrat. Not really, right? Social democracy is an interpretation of Marxism that says you can get a state-run economy, the banks, factories, and industries run by the people, but you get it gradually. There's no revolution. It comes one step at a time. Bernie Sanders is very open about the fact that he does not want a socialist planned economy. He wants a bigger welfare state, right? He's an advocate of capitalism. He says himself he does not oppose capitalism. His vision of democratic socialism is not contrary to capitalism. He's fine with capitalism, he says, but he just wants a bigger welfare state. Then you're not really a social democrat. Like the British Labour Party, when they got rid of Clause 4 from their constitution, they got rid of Clause 4, they're not really social democrats anymore. Social democracy is a variation of Marxism. It's the Second International. It's Karl Kautsky. It's Edward Bernstein, the guy who coined the term revisionism. It's the movement is everything, the goal is nothing. That socialism is built one step at a time. Bernie Sanders, as Kinky points out, Bernie Sanders is FDR, right? He is a welfare state liberal. But, you know, he's invoking the image of socialism because socialism is on people's minds. But socialism is the abolition of capitalism. It's a socialist planned economy. It's when the banks, factories, and industries operate not to make a profit, but in order to serve society as a whole. That's what socialism is. You know, now Jeremy Corbyn's back in. Who knows? Maybe they'll change Clause 4 back again. But at this point, the British Labour Party is not a party that actually advocates actual socialism, right? But they got rid of that in 1993, I believe. Maybe it was 96. But at some point, Tony Blair changed the Labour Party's constitution, got rid of the part calling for socialism. So the Labour Party in Britain are not actually, you know, at this point, they're not actually social democrats, right? Same for the French Socialist Party. Same for the German Social Democratic Party. These were Marxian social democratic parties at one point. They're still part of the Second International, the Socialist International. They don't really advocate socialism at this point. Interesting stuff. But a lot happening in the world. What's going on in the comments page? What's going on here? I'm going to change it to all chat. For some reason, I'm getting the top chat. I want to make sure I get everybody here. And German Social Democrats are not Marxists anymore since 1959. I didn't know it was that recently, but it doesn't surprise me, or it was that long ago. I mean, I know they're not Marxists anymore. But yeah, it's a crazy, crazy world out there. But I think more and more people are looking for some kind of alternative, right? People want a way out of capitalism. People want a better world. And so the ideas that we discuss here on these lives are going to be more and more important. You know, and I think we're facilitating a very, very good conversation here. And, you know, we really ultimately don't know what's going to happen in the upcoming election. I think it's going to be an interesting election season. And there's a lot of wild cards, right? And that let's keep in mind, world events move very, very rapidly these days, right? Things happen, boom, boom, boom. They're happening. It's a big deal. But what else is going on in the world? Ever notice how some people say the United States was founded as a capitalist country, therefore it cannot become socialist? Well, I mean, there you go. You know, that's like, you know, I mean, whatever. I obviously think that there could be changes, and I think that there, you know, the weird thing about the American Revolution, right, is that you know, a lot of the people who fought in the American Revolution believed that they were fighting to get equal rights, and believed they didn't realize they were fighting just for the plantation owners. You know, a lot of the Americans who fought in the American Revolution were convinced that land was going to be redistributed. You know, and that there were, you know, there were aspects of the American Revolution that were progressive. Now, obviously, the overall goal was they felt like the British Empire was holding them back. They wanted to expand, and there were different forces. Things are never as simple as you think, and things were complicated. And that, you know, the fact that the U.S. Constitution, or I'm sorry, not the U.S. Constitution, the Declaration of Independence. John Locke, who was an inspiration to the American Revolution, he said, life, liberty, and property. But they kind of realized that all the working class people, Boston, New York, elsewhere, who didn't own any property, they were not going to go out and die to own property, right? They didn't own any. So they changed it to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? Because there was an understanding that working class people didn't really identify with that property thing because they didn't own any property. Right? And that, you know, I mean, following the American Revolution, you had Shays' Whiskey Rebellion, and you had uprisings, and that very much the federal government was formed, you know, the U.S. Constitution, you had the Articles of Confederation, but then you had the federal government of the United States being formed and the U.S. Constitution being written in response to the fact that a lot of the people who fought in the American Revolution felt like they'd been duped, and they were angry. And that, you know, Alexander Hamilton, you know, I mean, that individual, people don't give him enough credit. Right? That he opposed slavery. He was a founder of the USA. He was an early president. He opposed slavery. And on top of that, Alexander Hamilton not only opposed slavery, but he supported the Haitian Revolution, The slaves of Haiti broke their chains, and he wanted the United States to recognize and do business with the Haitian slave revolutionaries who kicked out the French and established their own country, the first major slave uprising in Haiti, right? That was big. Now, somebody named Meditating Jesus is asking my opinion of the Communist Party USA. I think the Communist Party USA, they've got a lot of good people in there. You know, I know a few Communist Party members, and they're good people. I'm not a member of the Communist Party, never have been. They see things, you know, their way, and good for them, you know. I know a lot of young people are drawn to them. Their history is very powerful. I've talked a lot about their history and their role in fighting for, you know, unemployment insurance and mobilizing the country, and William Z. Foster is one of the people I admire the most. I've got every book that man wrote. I've got a picture of him on my wall, actually. I've got a picture of William Z. Foster hanging on my wall. Now you're asking, oh, Ronnie Miller's saying not the Communist Party, but the Party of Communists. Well, I know some of them. I know some of the people that started it when they were starting it. Good folks. I know they do Red Star Publishers, and they've arranged for some books to be published. You know, I mean, I think they're the ones, I believe it's Red Star Publishers that now has republished William Z. Foster's History of the Three Internationals. They publish, you know, a lot of good writing, and then a lot of people join Party of Communists because they are, you know, they're inspired by the legacy of the Communist Party. They don't like Communist Party USA, and so they're looking for something different. I don't endorse any of those groups. I'm not a member of any political party or any political organization at this point. Let me be very clear about that. And I don't want to get involved in, you know, this group is better than that group, and not what I'm here to do, right? Ultimately, I hate to say it, but I think none of these groups really have the answer. And I think all of these groups need to kind of critically think. There's a group of young people called Students and Youth for a New America. Great young folks, very inspiring, doing community service, but they're not a political party. They're not involved in the political process. They're not lobbying. They're not running in elections. They're, you know, putting forward socialist ideas in education, and they're serving the community. I think they're a fine group of young folks, but they're not a political party. So I don't get involved in this party is better than that party. And ultimately, you know, none of these parties are really parties, right? That a party, a communist party or a political party encompasses a mass, large group of people, right? There were a lot of people who asked me at the time when I was breaking off with the Workers' World Party, they asked me, why don't you start your own party, Caleb? And I thought about it for a moment. I thought, okay, so let's say I set up a website and formed the, like, Democratic Revolutionary Workers Liberation League Fight Back Resistance Labor Party. That would be a joke, right? And we've got so many parties now. I mean, you know, and none of them really mean anything. I hate to say it. None of the parties really matter, right? 99.9% of the working class has no idea any of these parties exist. Most of these parties are basically formed on the principle that you can only have one smart guy in a party. I'm not joking, right? You know, if you meet another smart guy, you know, if you're smart, you know, you got to form your own party because we got one guy here who does all the thinking. He's the smart guy, and this party is centered around them. You know, I don't play that game. Unfortunately, democratic centralism, the way democratic centralism has been interpreted by American leftists, it means we're all going to say the same thing. And if you're going to be in my party, you have to absolutely agree with me and repeat what I say. And if you have a brain of your own, well, get out, you know, if you got a brain of your own, because we have one smart guy. And every single one of these parties is centered around one, some cases 5, 6, some cases maybe even 10 individuals who have all the power. And the sad thing is a lot of young people join these various parties and they get disillusioned. They get frustrated because they see that they're not really going anyplace. They see that they don't really have a say in how they're run. They're never really treated, you know, and as a result, they go elsewhere. So I encourage people to engage in political innovation. And one thing I've said, and I'll say it here again, I dare you to break the rules. Look, there's a lot of people watching this live right now, right? And a lot of you ain't saying anything, and that's okay. No pressure to saying anything. The lurkers, right? I know a lot of you are in these various parties, and you know it's very funny. You know, every time I end up being in the presence of any like young people that are in a group, I'll get somebody who will nervously walk up to me and be like, "Hi, are you Caleb Maupin?" And I'll be like, "Yep." "Hi." And I know what they're thinking, right? I know what they're thinking, right? I've seen you on the internet. I love your videos. But if the leaders of my socialist group find out that I like you or find out that I'm friendly to you, I'm going to get in a huge amount of trouble. You know, I've seen it. And I know there's a lot of you out there, right? You are in the young communist groups. You're in the QWH or the XYZ or the IQL or the 12th International or the 13th International or the League to Establish the Revolutionary Organization or the 12th Party of the Trotsky Internet. You're watching this, all right? And basically, you like me, you like what I have to say. You don't agree with everything, and that's fine. I encourage people to disagree with me, right? But, you know, you like what I have to say. But the leaders of your group, you mentioned, oh, I've been watching Caleb Maupin on YouTube, and they went, what? That guy? You can't watch Caleb Maupin. He broke the rules. He's not saying things the way we say things. Oh, never mention, you know, I swear, it's hilarious, right? Young people that are into socialism love me. I meet young people that are into socialism, reading Marx and all that. They think I'm fascinating. They don't all agree with me. A lot of young people don't agree with me about China. A lot of young people don't agree with me about this issue or that issue. But they think I'm fun. And they like the conversations we have here. And they like what we're talking about on these lives, right? But they know that if they acknowledge that they like me, they're going to get in trouble. Right, that the leader of their group is gonna you know, I am off limits because I'm not politically correct, right? I say a lot of things in these lives that is heresy, right? Fine. I mean, what have I got to lose, right? You know, I mean, hey, you know, I have been called every nasty name in the Marxist vocabulary. I've got people saying that I'm a closet fascist. But I mean, you wouldn't know half the things I've been called. I don't care anymore. I don't, right? The people who don't like me are a section of U.S. society that is so infinitesimally small, you know, that I'm not going to try and pander to them. Honestly, I'm not going to, right? So, yeah, so you don't like me. Well, you know, that's great. You know what I mean? I'm not concerned about the movement right now. What they call the movement, you know, I mean, I think that there's a key moment that people should talk about, which is the struggle against nuclear power. The 1980s in the United States, in the 1980s, there was a movement against nuclear power. I mean, it was against nuclear weapons, but it was also against nuclear energy. And, you know, at the time, they had a lot of good points, right? Chernobyl, you know, the 3 Mile Island. Obviously, the way nuclear energy was being carried out was unsafe, and they needed to have safer nuclear energy. But a lot of what the anti-nuclear movement was saying was not scientific. It was not factual, that somehow the concept of nuclear energy is not wrong. If we can get power from splitting an atom, right, and get electricity from it, there's nothing wrong with that. If we can figure out how to do it in a safer way, fine. And actually, the way nuclear power works nowadays, it's a lot safer than it was back then. You know, nuclear power is not inherently bad, right? There's nothing inherently evil about nuclear power. But there was this mass movement against nuclear power, brought to you by two entities. One, big oil companies. Why were the big oil companies against nuclear power? They were afraid that nuclear power would put them out of business, right? If people start powering everything with nuclear, pretty soon we won't need oil and gas. And number two is brought to you by the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, right? Bet you didn't know. People are playing up this idea, you know, Bernie Sanders was over in Eastern Europe. There were joint protests, days that the Freeze movement, where people all over the Soviet Union and sections of the Soviet government were having joint protests and marches against nuclear power and marches against nuclear weapons on the same day that people in the United States were doing it. And the CIA was very much, you know, making friends, and there was a certain wing of the Soviet government that was getting in with the CIA. And so the CIA and the oil companies were basically set up this anti-nuclear movement, which was based on this premise, right? Based on this premise that somehow the concept of nuclear power is evil, right? I don't buy that. Now, nuclear power needs to be done safer, needs to be done in a more efficient way, but opposing the concept of nuclear power is awful. And, you know, Kinky pointed out that the way it's done now is not very energy efficient. Yes, we need nuclear fusion. They should be funding fusion energy research like crazy right now. That's what we need more than anything, is we need fusion energy, right? But regardless, right, you know, and who was, of course, supporting nuclear power? The Pentagon, the people that make the nuclear weapons, right? They think nuclear power is great, right? And the weapons manufacturers and the Pentagon, the people making money off the arms race, they were supporting it. There was a division within the ruling strata. The CIA and the oil companies were against nuclear power, and the Pentagon and the weapons manufacturers, they were for nuclear power. It was a divide. And so you had these big marches and rallies going on against nuclear power. And the Marxist movement all kind of looked at that and were confused. It's like, what do we do? So on the one hand, right, people, a lot of them realized, look, this is not a mass workers movement from below. It basically doesn't recognize that the USSR has the right to have nuclear weapons to protect itself. It opposes nuclear power as a concept, not the way it's being carried out. There were a lot of people, Marxists, who looked at this and they're like, what do we do here? And here's the thing. You had some groups that were, you could call them ultra-left, and they began going crazy, right? And I mean, I've heard reports of like some crazy Trotskyist groups beating up anti-nuclear activists with baseball bats and going crazy. Marxism is scientific. This is that was nuts, right? But then a lot of the Marxists said, you know what? Okay, it's big oil, it's the CIA, but hey, it's against the military-industrial complex. We're going to go into the anti-nuclear movement and recruit. We're going to pretend we agree with it. And hey, it's rallies, it's peaceniks, it's left. We're going to be part of it. And that's what most of the far left did. Most of the Marxist movement went into the anti-nuclear movement. And instead of them recruiting all these anti-nuclear activists, it seems like big oil and CIA ultimately recruited them. Most people that are Marxist nowadays, they're liberals, right? They say whatever liberals are saying, right? Climate change, the world's going to blow up. We're all going to die because of climate change. And lo and behold, that's because of capitalist profits. Marxism, it's almost like Firefox, right? You get Firefox on your computer, the web browser, and then you get an extension. And for most people that are Marxists, they're liberals, and they got this extension called Marxism, right? We need to raise the minimum wage, and yes, and capitalists make profits, and they're greedy, and we need social. It's just, being a Marxist is just kind of a tag on. It's an extension of being a liberal. You do what liberals do. You believe what liberals believe. You vote for who liberals vote for. You have the overall basic liberal worldview, but you tack Marxism onto it. That's not what being a Marxist is about, right? Not what being a Marxist is about. That strategic, Marxism is in a completely different worldview. It's not liberalism. And that was really lost. And I think that that's very important to remember. And that moment, the 60s left, there was a whole lot of CIA infiltration, and we know about the Congress for Cultural Freedom program of the CIA. But there was still a Marxist influence. You had the Progressive Labor Party, and you had, a lot of Marxist influence on it. But the 80s, what ultimately became of the left, that was a moment where you got, forces that really don't have left ideology kind of got the upper hand, and the left, strategically, because of the Cold War, because they thought that the Democrats and the CIA and big oil were more for détente, they joined liberals. They joined liberalism, and they kind of went in, and ultimately, that was a moment where the left started to decline, right? And I've talked a lot about the new communist movement and how they tried to do what leftists are supposed to do, right? They tried to go into neighborhoods and build political infrastructure and have communities where they cared for people and took care of people, and lo and behold, it didn't work. And there was just this belief that average Americans in Iowa and Kansas can never be recruited to Marxism, right? They're just too comfortable, too well off. Can't recruit them, so we got to do something else, right? We got to build peace rallies in Washington, D.C. We got to join the trade union movement and try to maneuver inside of it. We got to vote for Democrats. We got to be on the college campuses. We got to sell books. We got to try and be the leaders of black rebellions against police brutality. But this idea of building a mass Marxist movement, that is widespread in U.S. society and has territory and neighborhoods and takes care of people, ain't gonna happen, right? They just, all the baby boomer Marxists decided that was impossible because they did it for a decade and it didn't work, right? And then at the end of the decade, there was kind of an economic crisis and Jimmy Carter, and it ultimately led to the rise of Reagan. And a lot of the baby boomer leftists just decided in the early 80s, basically, that you can't win people to Marxism. You can't build a big Marxist movement in the USA. It just can't happen. It's impossible. And conditions have changed, right? I mean, the situation is changing. The polls show that socialism is very popular nowadays. The situation has changed, but these baby boomers who went through, I really sympathize with these people. I mean, if you read about what people went through in the 70s, the new communist movement, the Greensboro massacre, and what was done to the 5 brave organizers in Greensboro, North Carolina, I mean, these people, they paid a heavy price. They went out and they did what you're supposed to do. They got jobs in factories. They tried to recruit their coworkers. They promoted socialism, and they gave the whole of their lives to it, and a lot of them really suffered as a result. I mean, there's one guy I know, and he would talk about one of his coworkers. He worked in an auto plant for years, and one of his coworkers, she was promoting socialism, and one day, her other coworkers tried to blow up her car. Right? And they put a bomb on her car and tried to blow up her car, right? I mean, that's really nasty. I mean, what these people went through, these people made huge sacrifices, a lot of these people had degrees, multiple degrees, but they went and worked in factories because they wanted to spread communism among their coworkers. And I mean, these people, I give them credit, right? As much as I get mad at them and I'm frustrated with what they've done to the communist movement and all of that, hey, I give them their credit. They worked really hard. But at the end of the day, at the time that they were doing it, it couldn't be done because for most of the USA, the economy just wasn't going to allow it. But now the situation has changed. Now millions of Americans are at the point, where they could be won to socialism. But yet the Marxist movement is led by these people who say it can't be done. We tried that in the 70s. It can't be done. So we just got to be part of the movement of people who go to peace rallies and are liberals, right? And that's completely wrong. Marxism is not liberalism, right? I could see situations where strategically the Marxists would align with the Republicans against the Democrats, even though the Democrats are more liberal. I mean, that's not what I'm advocating right now. That's what I'm just telling you, right? That Marxism is not liberalism. It's a separate school of thought, and that in a lot of ways, for a lot of people, being a Marxist is just, it's an extension of being a liberal. And you can't, that's not the case, right? So, that's my 2 cents on the issue. And, I sympathize with those older folks, but we need to get back to doing what Eugene Debs did, right? That socialists, back what William Z. Foster did. Socialists were people in the neighborhood. When I was in Cleveland, Ohio, I had the privilege of going to meetings of a group called Black on Black Crime Incorporated, a black nationalist group in East Cleveland. And I saw the way they operated, right? Every Wednesday night, they had their meeting. 80, 90 people would turn up. They'd be talking about the hospitals that are going to close. They'd be talking about garbage being collected. They'd be talking about police brutality. And if you want to know what the Communist Party of the United States was in the 1930s, that's what it was. It was people organizing in their community. They had an ideology, they had a worldview and a perspective, but they were caring for people and they were building a movement on the ground, political infrastructure, right? And if you go to any other country in the world, even in first world countries, everyone knows the communist neighborhood where the communists are there and they have the local seats in the parliament and they're caring for people and they have their food program. It's not like that in the USA. The Black Panthers did it a little bit during the 70s. But since the 30s and 40s and even up into the 50s, we don't have that in the USA anymore. And that's what needs to happen. There needs to be a mass socialist movement of people espousing socialism in the United States. And until that happens, things are really not going to get better, right? It's not a question of, forming your little party and running candidates in the name of, your latest acronym of the, at QWHYZ party or, that's not what it's about. There needs to be a change in consciousness, right? And that Marxists need to be spreading their ideas. But on that note, I'm going to have to end, folks. It's been a pleasure. I'm sorry about the technical difficulties. I hope we can get that fixed for the next one. It's always good to have a chat with you. Hey, all my best to you. You all are great. I wish you all the best. And let's remember, these conversations we're having here are unique. No one is talking this way on the American left right now. No one else. You can't find this kind of conversation anywhere else. The conversation that we're having here is very, 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 very special. So I hope that you'll join it. I hope that you'll spread it. I hope you'll promote the videos. I hope you'll subscribe to this channel. I hope you'll encourage other people to. I hope you'll promote it because, the world is changing. We desperately need people to think the way we think and to start questioning this idea that bankers and profits ought to rule the world. Because I think the people can run society. We can organize the society to serve human need, not profits. So my best wishes to you all. Have a good evening. Bye for now. Bye-bye. Bye.